I served as a parole officer in Utah for 9 years, 4 months, and 18 days. Although it was vastly different from my time as a correctional officer, it became one of the few viable options for me after a serious car accident in the spring of '97. Many colleagues suggested I take medical retirement, buy a boat, and finally pursue that long-held dream of starting a charter service. However, that felt too much like giving up. The chance to work just 9 more years for a full pension and comprehensive medical coverage was a compelling reason to continue. So, instead of walking away with a check and a bum leg, I joined the Utah Department of Corrections as a parole officer. Over the years, I managed hundreds, possibly thousands, of cases. Unfortunately, I only accumulated a handful of stories that might pique your interest. Being a parole officer wasn't exactly thrilling, and it's amusing how movies portray us as tough bounty hunters, when in reality, we often resemble slow horses with a motley collection of aches and pains. I encountered only 3 or 4 major incidents throughout my career, yet those moments were just as intense, if not more so, than anything I faced as a corrections officer. One incident, in particular, almost cost me my life at the hands of a man who, in another life, could have been a cousin, nephew, or even a son. I first met Sean while he was living in a trailer park that served as temporary housing following his release from federal prison. This trailer park was part of a halfway home initiative we were running due to budget constraints. Only the most promising parolees were allowed to stay there, and Sean stood out among them. A former Marine flight mechanic, he had completed 2 tours before encountering severe challenges. The base where he served was subjected to relentless insurgent attacks, and he returned home with what he referred to as the shakes. Officially, this condition would be classified as PTSD, but Sean never labeled it that way. He simply described it as getting the shakes when he thought too deeply about certain things. Despite trying various medications and therapies, nothing seemed to help. Then, in a moment of desperate self-destruction, Sean smoked a bowl of meth at a Memorial Day party and discovered it alleviated his shakes. I was baffled by how meth could have such an effect. I would have guessed it would worsen his symptoms. Surprisingly, it focused him like a laser and calmed the tremors to almost nothing. Believing he had found a miracle cure, Sean began using meth occasionally whenever life became overwhelming. He said it made him feel renewed and better equipped to handle the challenges of transitioning from the Marine Corps with nothing but a glorified severance check. He started using more and more, first a little before work, then a little after. Soon he was using in his free time and eventually alone whenever the cravings hit. This led to a significant problem. One day, Sean found himself wanting to smoke more meth than he could afford. He didn't want to be that desperate drug addict who spent his last dollars on drugs. So instead, he approached a meth cook to learn how to make a batch. He gathered everything on his shopping list by either stealing or buying it. After helping the cook with a batch and making mental notes, Sean began cooking his own meth for personal use, keeping the batches small. However, just like when he first started smoking, the amounts he was cooking grew larger until he could no longer hide it. Eventually, the police raided his cookhouse and Sean was arrested. He ended up spending 12 years in federal prison. His sentence could have been much longer if not for his military background and impeccable behavior as an inmate. Without those factors, he likely wouldn't have been paroled 9 years into the 18-year sentence the judge imposed. In front of the judge, he probably demonstrated considerable enthusiasm for getting his life back on track. And that's precisely what I saw the first time I met him at the trailer park. I thought he would be one of the easiest cases I'd ever handled. He was eager to turn his life around, and each time I visited him or we met for breakfast at a nearby diner, his enthusiasm only seemed to grow. Months passed, and Sean was on track to receive all the early release recommendations he needed, including my own. However, when I arrived for a pre-arranged meeting, he wasn't there. I figured something must have gone wrong for him to miss the meeting. Unlike some other cases I had dealt with, I didn't believe he was trying to avoid me or play games. After building some trust, I called his cell phone. The first call went through, but it suddenly and abruptly went to voicemail. I started to feel a sinking sensation. In the best-case scenario, Sean was just running late, driving back to the trailer park and avoiding a traffic stop by not using his cell. But when I called him again, it went straight to voicemail with no dial tone, as if he had quickly turned off his phone. That sinking feeling deepened. I liked Sean and had high hopes for him, so the thought of him jeopardizing his progress and missing out on those recommendation letters weighed heavily on me, like I was a worried parent. I didn't leave right away. I paced back and forth in the dirt in front of his trailer, hoping to catch one of Sean's neighbors. He had mentioned borrowing a truck from them to get to work, so I wandered around the trailer park, hoping to find someone who could help. I knocked on several doors with no response until finally, at the last one, someone answered. I asked if they knew Sean, and they said yes. But when I inquired about his whereabouts, they gave me the usual, "That's none of your business" attitude. I explained that I was his parole officer, and that he wasn't in trouble. I just wanted to know where he was because I was concerned. It wasn't like him to miss a meeting. I wasn't trying to make up a story to get them to talk, and I would really appreciate it if they could help me out. The guy looked at me like I was clueless, and then told me Sean's mom had died, and he took it really hard. He mentioned that another trailer owner had been drinking with Sean for a while, but Sean was pacing and making phone calls. Then, out of nowhere, a truck pulled up, and Sean jumped in the back before driving off. I haven't seen him since, the guy added. When I asked how long ago that was, my heart sank when he said, Tuesday. So it had been 4 days, give or take. Sean could be halfway across the country by now, and if he was coping with terrible news, I had no idea what he might turn to. I couldn't blame him, but as I got back into my truck, I found myself praying, please, just stick to booze, Sean. Stick to booze. The last thing I wanted was to report this to my superiors. If it were some scumbag caught with child pornography, I would have come down hard on him. But Sean was far from that. If I went after him for one missed appointment, especially due to a family death, I wouldn't be able to look myself in the mirror afterward. The problem was leaving him alone for too long, especially in a state of grief. He might not pass a urine test, and if that happened, he would definitely go back to jail to serve out the rest of his sentence instead of being on parole. Of course, Sean wasn't my only parolee during that time, so I couldn't dedicate all my time to finding him. Over the next few days, I kept calling his cell, stopping by his trailer, and most importantly, I gave my number to the neighbor I spoke to and asked him to keep an eye out. A few days later, I received a call from the neighbor saying he had just seen Sean and a few others entering his trailer. I thanked him for the information, but before hanging up, he warned me that they didn't look like the kind of people who woke up early for Sunday service, so I might want to be careful if I was planning to arrest anyone. I definitely wasn't looking to make any arrests. I didn't even have the power to do so. But I wanted to make sure Sean was okay, and if his friends were getting in the way, that could pose a big problem for me. I drove over to the trailer park as quickly as possible, hoping to catch Sean before he did something he would regret. When I arrived, all the curtains of his trailer were drawn, and the music was so loud that I could hear it as I turned into the park, thumping out of some kind of sound system inside. Just to be safe, I put on the bulletproof vest I kept in my trunk and headed up to the front door of the trailer. I had to hammer on it just to be heard over the racket. When someone finally opened the door, it wasn't Sean, and they didn't look too pleased to see me. Standing in front of me was a guy who looked like his dad was Bigfoot and his mom was a skeleton. With all the narcotics in his system, I probably looked like the devil himself. He slammed the door shut, and even over the loud music, I could hear him scream, "It's the cops!" At first, I found the guy's reaction kind of funny. Sure, I was wearing a vest and had a gun on my hip, but I wasn't a cop. I almost smirked as I peered around to a window, trying to look through a crack in the curtain. It would have been in their best interest to throw all their drugs in the chemical toilet, but the fact was, I wasn't there in that capacity. I was only there to talk to Sean. Everything else was secondary. If they had known how understanding I was prepared to be, I'm not sure they would have reacted so frantically. I started calling out that I wasn't a cop, that they should relax and let me speak to Sean for a minute, but it didn't seem to do any good. I could hear the people inside scrambling around, cursing, saying things about the cops being outside. I repeated myself again, and that's when the first bullet smashed through the trailer siding. It all happened so quickly that at first, I wasn't quite sure what had happened, or maybe I didn't want to believe it was happening. I backed up upon hearing the sound, but the shot came through way below eye level, so I didn't see the bullet hole or realize what was happening until the next few shots came through. I remember throwing myself back onto the little wooden deck that led to the door, feeling almost certain I had broken something when I landed on my back and shoulders. I think I must have knocked the wind out of myself too, because for a moment I was scared I'd been shot. But after seeing no entry wounds on the vest and no blood on my shirt, I pulled my sidearm and did the only thing I could. I emptied the entire clip into the front of the trailer. There wasn't any time to consider the implications. I just had to scare them into keeping their heads down long enough for me to get back to my truck. I arrived just in time to see someone shatter the windshield with a well-aimed shot. Someone inside the trailer had a clear view of the driver's seat, meaning there was no way to get in or out without taking a bullet. I crawled underneath the truck and out the other side, taking cover behind one of the tires. I reloaded, dialed 911 on my cell phone, and lay there, hoping no one would come out in pursuit of me. Fortunately, someone else had heard the shot, so uniformed officers arrived a minute or two faster than they would have from my call alone. By the time they got there, they noticed what I had realized around the same time. Sean's trailer was on fire. The officers and I figured everyone inside would have fled before the flames got too intense. But from their perspective, they had no idea what they were facing. They likely thought that if they ran outside, they would be shot to pieces. So staying inside and trying to extinguish the flames felt like their best chance. As the officers and I moved toward the trailer, someone inside pulled back a curtain. Their silhouette, complete with a gun, looked like one of those training targets, making it just as easy for the officers to shoot. What followed was another prolonged gunfight. As more shots went into the trailer, the less those inside could fight the flames. The fire grew, and the shooting eventually subsided. In the end, the fire department arrived far too late to save anyone inside. I honestly don't know if any of them were still alive when they got there, but once the flames were out, everyone inside was either burned to a crisp or had died from smoke inhalation or a grim combination of the two. It took the county coroner a long time to identify the victims and determine the exact cause of each person's death. Only one person died from a gunshot, and that was Sean. The coroner identified him through his Marine Corps dental records and concluded that he had been dead before the flames reached him. There was no way to know whose bullets had struck him, mine or those of the responding officers. But deep down, I think I know. I believe I killed the one person who didn't truly need my help. Sean would have faced the grief of his mom's death. He might have gone off the rails, but I think her spirit would have pulled him back. I should have reported that first no-show meeting as soon as it happened. That way, he could have been picked up long before I had the chance to empty my pistol into his trailer. He might have gone back to prison, perhaps for a long time, but at least he would still be alive. There's a phrase I heard long ago that never made much sense until that day. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. The most interesting man I ever met was a tunneling contractor. I first encountered him when I was assigned as his parole officer after he served 23 years of a 45-year sentence. Right away, I recognized him as one of the good ones. In my experience, there are two types of parolees: those who will cause problems and those who won't. They come in various shapes and sizes, but you can always categorize them, often just by looking at them. Initially, I thought Mike might be the troublesome type, not so much because of his past actions, but because of the nature of his offenses. In the late 80s, Mike worked as a tunneling engineer for a major construction company in the Southwest. He was involved in projects for tourist attractions, mining, waste management, and even an R&D facility for a pharmaceutical company, earning good money in the process. However, one day, his boss informed him that work was drying up and his services would no longer be needed. This left Mike in a tough spot. He had a mortgage, credit card debt, and car payments. With a 7-month slump in the regional construction market, he struggled to get any callbacks from other companies, let alone interviews or contracts. Mike began to feel desperate. Then, just as he was facing the possibility of default and foreclosure, he received an unexpected call from someone offering him work. He felt it was a stroke of luck. He was ready to dig a tunnel to China if it meant keeping the repo men at bay. However, as he spoke with the representative from this potential employer, he realized this job would be different from any he had done before. Mike offered to provide his license number, insurance, and bonding information, standard requests for 95% of employers before discussing a project. Yet, the caller seemed unconcerned. In a manner that could have felt unsettling if it weren't for the job offer, the man assured Mike they were familiar with his work and had done their homework. They were ready to offer him the job once he signed a confidentiality agreement. Throughout his years of digging and blasting tunnels, Mike had never been asked to sign anything resembling a confidentiality or non-disclosure agreement. This immediately signaled to him that this job would be different. However, when he heard the pay rate, he nearly choked. The most he had ever earned in a single day was about $800, which is a solid wage for any contractor, especially in the early years of his career. The job being offered, however, was $2,000 in cash at the end of each day. Mike described it as feeling like a kiss on one cheek and a slap on the other. While $2,000 a day was exceptional, receiving it in cash seemed too good to be true. Yet, given his circumstances, he couldn't afford to turn it down. Rather than outright refusing, he decided to go along, see what the job entailed, and make a firm decision later. A few days later, the caller instructed him to drive to the parking lot of a diner near Columbus, New Mexico, arriving by 10 p.m. When Mike arrived, he expected the job to be at the diner, but instead found a group of men waiting in the cold. After identifying himself, an authoritative figure told him to wait with the others. Eventually, a long Greyhound-style bus arrived, and Mike assumed they would be heading to the work site. What he didn't expect was for everyone to receive a blindfold. This understandably made everyone nervous, but they were reassured about the pay and reminded they could leave at any time. The only condition was that they had to wear the blindfolds during transport to and from the site. A couple of guys chose to return to their cars and drive away, which, in retrospect, was exactly what Mike should have done. As previously mentioned, Mike had his plan laid out. He boarded the bus, put on his blindfold, and waited to be told to remove it. He noted that the bus must have traveled along a highway for a while because the ride was quite smooth. However, that changed when they turned onto what was clearly a side or dirt road. After a short while, the bus came to a halt. Instead of being allowed to take off their blindfolds, Mike and the others were instructed to disembark while still blindfolded and walk into a large building before they could finally remove their masks. Inside, Mike described the place as resembling a warehouse that had been stripped of shelving, with the floor paneling ripped up. Someone had already started digging a deep hole, but they had to wait for the engineers to arrive before they could really begin opening up the tunnel. He observed that, despite the secretive atmosphere, it was a very professional operation. Whoever was behind the tunnel project had all the necessary materials and machinery. They just lacked the expertise. Before work commenced, someone inquired about the secrecy, and they were told it was a corporate decision. Operating in a fiercely competitive market required certain security measures to ensure their employer maintained an advantage. This explanation seemed to satisfy most of the group, but Mike sensed that a few, himself included, felt that what they were doing wasn't entirely legal. And he was right. Mike earned nearly $30,000 before one morning. As the bus returned to the diner parking lot just before dawn, federal agents ambushed them. They dragged everyone out and arrested them on the spot. It turned out their task had been to dig a tunnel under the border with Mexico, and their employers were the Juarez drug cartel. Consequently, Mike and the others faced a slew of serious charges, some of which implicated them as active members of an international drug smuggling operation. He received a 45-year sentence, but that's not the story I want to share today. As outrageous as that story is, it's not the most frightening one Mike ever told me. This incident occurred during Mike's first week in federal prison, where he found himself a small and inexperienced fish thrown into dark and stormy waters. He described that first week as the most terrifying of his life. While he had spent a long time in jail that counted toward his time served, being transferred to a federal facility shattered any hope he had of appealing the charges against him. The prosecution painted him as a hardened cartel operative who jeopardized national security for personal gain. All the cash he earned was seized, and he liquidated his assets to hire the best defense attorney he could afford. But it was all in vain. When his cell door clanged shut on that first night, it took all of Mike's strength not to break down and cry. At just 24 during his arrest and 25 by the time he arrived at federal prison, he was still very young. Now almost 60, I look back and see that at 25, you're still basically half a kid. It's hard to fathom how he got involved in such a reckless scheme. Even as someone who values law and order, I can't say Mike's punishment truly fit the crime. Mike was scared, but he wasn't naive. He understood he needed to align himself with an established group for safety in numbers. He did this quickly and learned his timing was perfect. Anyone who showered alone became a target for Black Betty. Betty wasn't his first name. His last name was Bettany or something similar. He earned the nickname Black not because of his race, but because he instilled fear in everyone. I heard he was just shy of 7 feet tall and weighed around 200 pounds. He was tough and could fight, but the worst part was that every so often, Black Betty had a predilection for his fellow inmates. In a group, you could shower together, and although Black Betty sometimes followed and watched, he wouldn't act on anyone. However, if you were alone and one of the stragglers who showered solo, Black Betty would follow you in and take you. Mike said he avoided showering for days, waiting until he and his new buddies decided to go together. When the time came, he was eager to shower, as he had developed a serious case of body odor that smelled unbearable. But when it was time to head to the shower block, he was told he had to go alone. At first, Mike thought it was some kind of joke, but it wasn't. His new buddies, who suddenly weren't acting much like buddies anymore, were deadly serious. He was going to go first and alone, and if he had any other ideas, he could not expect to survive the night. Mike was stunned. It felt like a nightmare he would wake up from at any moment. But he didn't wake up because it was real, and he was screwed. He said he needed to take a shower, not just wanted to, but needed to. So he waited it until a few other new inmates headed down, looking scared and alone, hoping to get lost in the crowd. And by crowd, I mean maybe 2 or 3 other convicts who were aware of the threat Black Betty posed. Everyone tried to wash up quickly, but it wasn't fast enough. Betty had seen them walking off to the showers and followed, soap and towel in hand. As soon as he appeared, everyone started rushing off, but Black Betty didn't pay them any mind. He had his eyes fixed on Mike. When Mike tried to slip past like the other new inmates, Black Betty blocked his way, backing him up against the wall of the shower block and saying things that made Mike's skin crawl. He warned Mike that if he fought back, it would only make things worse. Mike thought there was no way he would just give in, but he also knew he couldn't win a one-on-one fight with Black Betty. Still, he figured the best option was to give it his all, and if Betty killed him in the process, well, there were worse fates than death. With his back against the wall, Mike was about to tell his would-be attacker that he'd die before he turned around when he saw a flash of movement over Betty's shoulder. Suddenly, someone hooked a towel around Betty's neck and yanked it back, sending him slamming onto the tiled floor of the shower block. The impact cracked Betty's head open, and while his eyes were still rolling in their sockets, the guys who had ordered Mike to shower alone appeared and stabbed Black Betty so many times that he looked like a bloody sponge by the time they were done. Before they left, Betty's assailants told Mike, "You didn't see anything," which is exactly what he told the warden when he was dragged into his office later that day. He was so traumatized by what he had witnessed that the warden and his top staff had no trouble believing his story. They knew Mike didn't stab Betty over 100 times. They just didn't know who did. When Mike wandered back onto the wing, the first people who wanted to talk to him were his buddies. They showered him with smokes, contraband, and all kinds of commissary. Mike said they even had a plastic cup full of prison wine waiting for him to gulp down out of sight of the guards. Long story short, they had used him as bait. Betty wouldn't go for just anyone. Mike was his type. It was either risk Mike or keep everyone else at risk, because Betty wasn't just a habitual predator, he was an opportunistic one too. While Betty was around, no one was safe, but with him gone, Mike became a cell block hero. His arrival had given them a golden opportunity to take Betty down, as they knew Mike was the kind of new fish Betty would target. The thing was, Mike's buddies knew that if they let him in on the plan, there was a chance he'd be too scared to go through with it. So, a little coercion seemed in order. Mike stayed with that group for a long time before later being transferred to a medium-security prison called 3 Rivers, where he served out the rest of his sentence. Fortunately, there was no one like Black Betty around to terrorize the inmates. To me, the idea of being used as bait to lure out a human predator is one of the most frightening concepts I can imagine. While I've heard that ignorance is bliss, not knowing you're the bait might be even more terrifying. What's worse, Betty's killers floated the idea of only beginning their ambush once he was, shall we say, occupied with Mike. That way they could ensure he'd be suitably distracted, but it also meant condemning Mike to a truly nightmarish fate. Thankfully for him, they decided they couldn't live with that, at least not by unanimous decision. The last time I spoke with Mike, he was driving for Uber in Dallas. He mentioned he had a girlfriend and that she had a child, and he felt more like a father every day. He's come a long way since digging tunnels in Mexico, and even further since being used as bait for a monster. I'll be completely honest with you. I had next to no idea what I wanted to do with my life when I first applied to university. I'd always been interested in crime and police drama, so I had an inkling that I'd end up doing something related to criminal justice. I just wasn't exactly sure what it would be. My mom had dreams of me becoming a barrister or an attorney here in the UK, but I didn't think I had the smarts for that kind of thing. I also didn't fancy anything too morbid, which put me at odds with almost everyone else on my course. Most of them wanted to get into forensics or CID, which is where you go to become a homicide detective or join the drug squad. On the other hand, I felt like I wanted to do something a bit more analytical, something impactful, but more behind the scenes. I know that makes me seem like some fussy little bugger, and I wouldn't blame you for thinking that. Yet, if I can make one little correction, I think I was more like an indecisive little bugger. But a few years of study helped me see that. The more I studied, the more I approached a kind of epiphany. Statistically, it's only a small portion of the population that commits crime, usually less than 10% of the country's overall population. Then with certain crimes, that statistic is even smaller. For example, with shoplifting, it's only something like 0.2% of the British population that accounts for all incidents of shoplifting. That's only about 100,000 people out of a population of almost 70 million. My point is that it seemed like the best way to reduce certain types of crime was to focus on preventing reoffending, as opposed to harsher sentences for said reoffending, which would inevitably cause a person to sink deeper into criminality. Once I'd made my mind up about that, my ever-elusive career path lit up in front of me, and I took my first step on the road to becoming a probation officer. I volunteered with the Prison Advice and Care Trust when I was in my 3rd year, an organization that provides support services to newly released prisoners. I honestly just did it to get a taste of what it would be like working with former prisoners, as I still had a few lingering doubts about whether or not I'd be any good at it. But when it came to applying for the trainee probation officer program following my graduation from university, the Ministry of Justice practically bit my arm off owing to that prior experience. I spent 6 months attending a nearby learning development unit, where I was taught the tricks of the trade. After a series of rigorous computer-based tests, I was cleared as an officer of Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. It felt a bit surreal at first, especially when I told my friends back home about it. They couldn't picture me dealing with hardened criminals on a daily basis, and honestly, neither could I. I underwent a lot of conflict management and de-escalation training at the LDU, which was valuable, but I also heard a couple of horror stories that served as examples of how not to handle tense situations with a client. That's the word we were taught to use by clients. Some believe it's a much better term than probationer or ex-prisoner, as it sounds softer and more hopeful. However, it never really sat right with me. Client makes it seem like we're doing them a favor, when in reality I think that choosing to go straight is the biggest favor they could do for us. Anyway, my first few cases were massively challenging, but after that, I started to get the hang of things. I dealt with a lot of young men who had been caught in a street fight on a drunken Saturday night. They weren't hardened criminals, and the last thing they wanted was to go back to prison. So getting them into work and sticking to the routines we laid out was relatively easy. Then there were individuals in prison for dealing drugs. Some had been incarcerated for longer stretches and seemed genuinely interested in getting out of the game. However, the ones who had been in for 3 or 4 months for selling cannabis often seemed set on going straight back to dealing, no matter what advice I offered. I had one young man who claimed he signed up to do bicycle deliveries for Uber Eats. I actually saw him zipping around town on 2 different occasions. I'd never seen anyone so eager to get back to work. However, when I checked with Uber Eats using the bogus courier ID he provided, I discovered he had completed a grand total of 2 or 3 deliveries before using his big green delivery bag as a cover to return to dealing. For the most part, that was about as exciting as it got, clients trying to give you the runaround, requiring me to chase down their whereabouts and activities. But I quickly came to prefer that more mundane work, as the alternative was far worse. Every so often, I was assigned one of 2 types of cases, a sex offender or a murderer. There were exceptions here and there, but being around someone who has taken a life creates a palpable heaviness in the room. I'm not referring to people convicted of things like manslaughter or death by dangerous driving. Those individuals are often haunted by the lives they've taken until the day they die. I'm talking about murderers, people convicted of killing in cold blood, for money, or just for the sick thrill of it. 1 or 2 of them I would never have guessed were killers without having seen their case files, and I think they were the creepiest of the lot. You could see why someone might trust them enough to put themselves in a vulnerable position. But the single creepiest client I've had so far was a sex offender. Don't get me wrong, they're all frightening people in their own way, but they're especially terrifying if the offense involves children. Obviously, I wasn't dealing with child killers or dangerous predators against children, because they tend to receive whole life tariffs and therefore have no probation. However, some of the clients I did deal with, who had been imprisoned for these offenses, were just as sick, predatory, and creepy as the ones who had killed. They just never crossed that line and took a life. I was about 2.5 years into my career when my boss dropped by my desk with a caseload for me to work through. A caseload contains anywhere from a handful of cases to 2 dozen or more. You can generally count on a bigger caseload to include a lot of low-priority clients, i.e., those released after serving sentences for relatively minor offenses. You might get a drink driving case, or someone who perjured themselves in court, which happens more often than you'd think. All you had to do was check in with them every so often, have a chat and a cup of tea, and they'd typically stick to their post-release goals. It would be a time-consuming caseload, but generally not a stressful one. The stressful cases came when the caseload was only 3 or 4 files deep. If it was that small, you knew what to expect, a murderer or a sex offender. This caseload was no different. There were 4 cases, a murderer, a second murderer, a third murderer, and a sex offender. As usual, my heart sank when I saw the words on that 4th file. Dealing with these types of people was always an unpleasant experience, but when the offense is related to the abuse or exploitation of children, it's doubly skin-crawling. With some clients, it pays to be emotional, because when they see that you genuinely care about them, that they're not just a number or a statistic, they start to care too. But every time I walked into a room with a convicted sex offender, I had to leave my emotions at the door. It's not an unconscious act either. In the past, I've had to actively pretend that the person in front of me was no different from any other client. I made no reference to what they had done, focused entirely on their future, and kept whatever they had been convicted of completely out of my head. Because if, even for one small second, you remind yourself that they preyed on a child, you just can't do your job anymore. It was this process of switching off my emotions that I found myself repeating one morning on my first visit to the offender I had been assigned to. Now, I'd get the sack if I used this bloke's real name, so I'll just call him Jimmy. As repulsive as it is, this man had a strangely similar vibe to Jimmy Savile. He didn't have the hair, the chains, or the tracksuit, nothing like that, but he exuded this let's be friends kind of vibe, along with an air of arrogance, as if he'd forgotten where he had come from and why he was there. In his 50s, he looked relatively harmless at first glance, but once you knew what he had been convicted of, you realized just how dangerous he really was. Back when he was in his 20s, Jimmy had been working for a painting and decorating firm and drove a small 3-wheeled van from job to job. One day, he saw an 11-year-old girl playing in the street with her friends after school. He called her over and started offering to teach her to smoke. It was a wild thing to do in this day and age, but it was the 70s back then, a very different time. Anyway, the girl accepted the offer, but she was scared that her mom would see. Jimmy then got her into his van and drove her off to a secluded spot. However, he didn't try to teach the girl to smoke. Instead, he attempted to teach her to do something else entirely. When the girl refused, Jimmy tied her up, beat her black and blue, and then kicked her out of his van before driving off. The girl walked 2 miles back into town with bindings still around her wrists and went straight to the nearest police station to make a report. Jimmy was convicted based on the testimony of the girl, her friends, and a passerby who had heard a girl crying in the parked van but didn't think anything of it until the police made an appeal for information. That, along with a trove of indecent images found in his flat, landed Jimmy almost 50 years in prison for each separate offense, and he got out after 35 years. My first meeting with him was the same as any other, a basic introduction to myself and the probation scheme, followed by a rough outline of what would be expected of him over the months to come. Obviously, clients are sometimes restricted from going near certain places, and in Jimmy's case, he was barred from anywhere children might be. The probation service very much takes a busy hands or happy hands approach to rehabilitation. The idea is that the best way to keep a person from being tempted to go to certain places is to ensure they have hobbies. I know it sounds daft, giving this creep a jigsaw puzzle and expecting him to stop wanting to touch kids, but studies have shown that if you keep these individuals occupied and can tire them out mentally or physically, the risk of long and short-term reoffending drops by 50%. In our line of work, that's a significant number. So during the first visit, when it came to briefly covering the whole hobbies thing, Jimmy mentioned that he had taken up sketching in prison and continued it post-release because it kept his head straight, as he put it. I then asked if he had any drawings to show me, and he said he did. A lot of clients will claim to have a hobby or that they've taken up running or any number of things, but when you call them on it, they often haven't yet picked up the trainers or signed up for anything because they've been oh so busy post-release. But then Jimmy got up, walked over to the little coffee table in his living room, and brought back a sketchbook of things he had been working on. He opened the book, and right away I was struck by how good he was. There were all these amazingly drawn ones, too, in all kinds of different poses. I asked Jimmy if he liked horses, and he told me not really. They were just the hardest thing to draw. Draw a horse, and you can draw a human, no problem, he said. He mentioned a few other things about form and curvature, but I wasn't really listening at that point. I was completely dumbfounded by how impressive his drawings were. Considering that he had been practicing for the better part of 2 decades, He was exactly as good as he should have been. Still, I was awfully impressed. If he already had a hobby boxed off, then it made my job a lot easier. I could use his drawing as proof of his extracurricular activities, which also gave me huge peace of mind. Offenders have a recidivism rate that floats around 15%, depending on which studies you read, and that's always in the back of your mind when you're dealing with them. It could be your actions or your observations that send them back to prison before they get a chance to reoffend. That's a lot of pressure having a serial shoplifter go back to robbing, causing the Gordon's Gin Company to lose a tenner, versus a kid who reoffends and has to deal with the consequences for years, possibly even for the rest of their lives. I kept a close eye on Jimmy, and although I won't say where, I managed to get him back into work. Everything appeared to be going okay, and for a while, I was half convinced that he really did want to go back on the straight and narrow. However, there were other things that made me suspect he hadn't quite turned over a new leaf. He seemed to be trying a bit too hard to convince me that he was ready to live a normal life. And whenever something in our discussions didn't go his way, it was like his fake happy-go-lucky persona dropped for a second, revealing the real Jimmy underneath. It was that duplicity that made me want to keep a closer eye on him. And in situations like that, the devil can quite literally be in the details. For example, the halfway house we placed Jimmy in was in this big old Georgian-looking building, and each of the rooms had floor-to-ceiling windows. This meant that on my way in to have a chat with him, I could actually see into the living room of his little flat before I reached the front door. One day, as I was walking in, I spied him through the window working on another one of his drawings. But instead of the book with the gray cover, like the one he had shown me during the first visit, I could clearly see that the book he was drawing in had a sort of pinkish purple cover. If it had been any other color, I might have missed it, but that distinctive hue caught my eye. Once I was inside, it was business as usual, emotionless as always. But just as I was leaving, I asked him if he had moved on to a new sketchbook. Instead of showing me his latest work, he gave me a confused look and said, "No, I'm still working on the same one." I told him I was quite certain that he had been drawing in a pink sketchbook, as I caught a glimpse of him on the way in. With the same bewildered expression, Jimmy claimed to have no idea what I was talking about. I knew he had been drawing in a different colored sketchbook. There was no way I was mistaken, so I reminded him that hiding things or engaging in any kind of duplicity was a very bad look for someone in his position. He put on that "let's be friends" attitude again and invited me to search the flat for any sign of this non-existent pink sketchbook. I didn't call his bluff not right away. If he was confident enough to invite me to search his flat, then he probably had a very effective hiding place. Although I had next to no idea what was in it, I knew I had to find it. As I mentioned earlier, if a client displays any kind of duplicitous behavior, it can speak volumes. In the case of that Uber Eats cannabis dealer, the consequences might be minimal, but for someone like Jimmy, incompetence on the part of a probation officer can spell disaster for an innocent member of the public. The only problem was that I couldn't exactly go throwing around allegations willy-nilly. If I went to my bosses and told them I suspected a client of doing something sneaky, asking officers to turn his flat upside down to find a notebook I wasn't even certain was there, I could risk losing my job if the police didn't find anything. I'm not saying I want to live in a world where past and present prisoners have no rights and are denied a chance to turn their lives around. I respect the fact that I needed evidence of my suspicions, but sometimes bridging the gap between suspicion and accusation can be very frustrating, especially when it comes to someone as cunning as Jimmy. It took about 6 or 7 weeks before I was able to catch him drawing in that little pink book again. I was in my car, binoculars in hand, which, by the way, was about the only time I ever felt like the trench coat wearing noir detective I had always dreamed about and read about as a kid. Once I was satisfied that he was using his little pink book, I gave him a quick call on my mobile while I continued to watch him. He actually jumped when he heard his phone ringing, and when he picked up, I saw him undergo that reverse werewolf transformation, going from startled and moody to greeting me like a long-lost friend. I told him that I'd been a right div and messed up my diary, double booking our meeting for the next day. I followed up by asking him, in the nicest way possible, if I could stop by for a chat in the next 5 minutes since I was just around the corner. Jimmy said, "Sure, no problem," and we ended the call. I then watched as Jimmy closed the pink book, picked it up, and walked off to a corner of his flat before bending down. The next time I saw him, he had no pink book in his hand. Wherever he was hiding it, it was in that particular corner he had scurried off to before appearing empty-handed. It made sense that he couldn't hide the book in his bathroom, as the moisture would likely ruin the pages. So it had to be in his living room somewhere, and it had to be down pretty low. The next time Jimmy was at work, I enlisted the help of 2 community support officers to search his flat. I instructed them to pay particular attention to one specific corner of the room. About 10 minutes later, after pulling up a loose section of carpet, one of the PCSOs called me over to a gap in the floorboards and asked, "Is this what you're looking for?" It was a little pink book. In a weird way, I was actually quite excited to see what was in it. A lot of criminals try to re-establish connections when they leave prison, so there was a slim chance that the book might contain details of other active predators. If that were the case, turning it into my bosses would earn me major recognition. But if I'm being honest, nothing could have prepared me for what was inside that book. About 1/3 of it was filled with incredibly detailed drawings of school-aged children, all bound and gagged in various ways and positions. Much like the horses Jimmy used to draw, the pictures of the children were shockingly detailed and lifelike. Their little faces were twisted in pain or fear, or they stared back at their creator with wide, frightened eyes. But unlike the horse drawings, which were so unexpectedly impressive, they verged on awe-inspiring. These drawings made me feel sick to my stomach. It was as if I were holding a piece of radioactive material. I know that might sound melodramatic to some people, but that's exactly what it felt like to me. The book radiated hideousness. I wanted to seal it up, burn it, and bury its ashes under 20 feet of earth. Whoever drew those pictures was a very, very sick person, and the thought that I had been sharing cups of tea with him made me want to take a shower in hot bleach. I only managed to look at 2 or 3 of the drawings before I slammed the book shut. My heart was pounding as I asked the support officers to stay put for a while. Then I called my boss to report what we had found. Seeing those drawings was probably one of the darkest moments of my entire life. But knowing that I had secured critical evidence was one of the highlights, and the adrenaline rush that followed matched the gravity of the moment. Within the hour, uniformed officers were dispatched to Jimmy's workplace, where he was arrested and transported back to prison to await the parole board's decision. Once it was determined that he had breached his license, the board ruled that he would serve the remaining 15 years of his sentence. And that, thank Christ, was the end of my working relationship with Jimmy. Back at 45 Division, RHQ, it was pats on the back all around for me. I was the office favorite for about 2 weeks because it felt like we had accomplished something truly significant. Everyone, including the parole board, believed that Jimmy was almost certainly on the path to reoffending. If he had fooled us all and been allowed back into society, he could have caused untold damage to any number of children, including the children of the people we worked with. I think that's why the outcome was received so well. I had defused a ticking time bomb that could have exploded in anyone's face. And in a way, that goes right back to why I joined the probation service in the first place. I had found what I was good at, and what I was good at made a difference. Did you enjoy this content? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Support us with a like and subscribe so our channel can reach more people. Thanks for watching until the end.